The sky above northeastern France darkened as thousands of German aircraft blackened the horizon. The date was May 10, 1940. For 8 months, the so-called phony war had lulled French soldiers into a false sense of security. Now that illusion was about to be shattered with devastating force. In the hours that followed, the German Wehrmacht would unleash a revolutionary form of warfare that would render France's supposedly impregnable defenses obsolete. The soldiers of Europe's largest army were about to face the shocking reality of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a military doctrine that would transform modern combat forever. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The French soldiers manning the Maginot Line fortifications along the Franco-German border that morning had little reason to suspect catastrophe. Many were reservists, civilians just months ago who had reluctantly exchanged their ordinary lives for military service. France had spent years and billions of francs constructing what military planners believed was an impenetrable system of concrete fortifications, anti-tank obstacles, artillery emplacements, and underground bunkers. The Maginot Line represented the culmination of French defensive doctrine, a reaction to the horrific losses suffered in the static trench warfare of the First World War. We will never again experience 1914-1918, French military theorists had insisted. The national psyche, scarred by the loss of an entire generation of young men in the previous war, had embraced a defensive mindset. Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun and future head of the Vichy regime, summarized this philosophy. Fire kills. The belief was simple. Defensive firepower would always overcome offensive maneuvers. This doctrine permeated the entire French military establishment. At French military headquarters in Vincennes, General Maurice Gamelin, the 68-year-old commander-in-chief, maintained an antiquated command structure. While German officers communicated via radio networks and field telephones, Gamelin relied on motorcycle couriers to deliver messages. His headquarters lacked even a radio transmitter. The French High Command embodied a military establishment trapped in the tactics of a previous era. In stark contrast, across the border, the German military had undergone a profound transformation. The humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles had forced German military thinkers to develop new doctrines that could overcome numerical inferiority. Officers like Heinz Guderian had studied the theories of British military innovators J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Little Hart, embracing the concept of mechanized warfare and close cooperation between armor, infantry, and air power. The German plan, Fall Gelb, case yellow, was audacious. Rather than attacking the heavily fortified Maginot Line directly, the main thrust would come through the dense Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, terrain the French High Command considered impenetrable to tanks. German General Erich von Manstein had convinced Hitler to adopt this approach, abandoning the conventional strategy that French intelligence had anticipated. On that fateful May morning, as German bombers appeared over French positions, Corporal Marcel Duchamp of the 57th Infantry Division was writing a letter to his wife in Lyon. Like many French soldiers, his war experience had thus far consisted mainly of boredom, punctuated by occasional guard duty and endless drills. A school teacher in civilian life, Duchamp had been drafted in September 1939, following France's declaration of war. The most dangerous thing at the front, he had joked in his previous letter, is dying of boredom. At 5:35 a.m., the distant rumble of artillery interrupted his writing. Minutes later, a deafening explosion rocked the bunker as a Luftwaffe bomb struck nearby. The war had finally arrived, but not in the manner anyone had expected. The initial German assault did not directly target the French positions. Instead, Luftwaffe bombers struck Dutch and Belgian airfields, destroying many aircraft before they could take off. Simultaneously, German paratroopers seized key bridges and defensive positions in the Netherlands and Belgium. As French and British intelligence had predicted, Germany appeared to be executing a repeat of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, a massive sweep through the Low Countries to outflank French defenses. Responding to this apparent threat, General Gamelin ordered the implementation of Plan D, the advance of French and British forces into Belgium to meet the German attack. The cream of the Allied armies, including the French First Army and the British Expeditionary Force, moved northward, exactly as the Germans had hoped. What Gamelin and his staff failed to recognize was that this attack was merely a feint. The real German thrust would come through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, precisely where the French defensive line was weakest. Lieutenant Pierre Moreau of the French 55th Infantry Division was positioned along the Meuse River near Sedan. His sector was considered a quiet zone, defended primarily by second-rate divisions composed of older reservists. The terrain, dense forest and hills leading to the river, was deemed unsuitable for tanks. Military doctrine held that it would take at least 9 days for a significant enemy force to navigate the difficult terrain, providing ample time for reinforcements to arrive. As reconnaissance reports of German movements through the Ardennes reached French headquarters on May 11th and 12th, they were largely dismissed. Impossible, declared General Georges Blanchard, when informed that German armor was moving through the forest. The Ardennes is impenetrable. This fatal misapprehension would soon be shattered. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground told a different story. German reconnaissance units, followed by 7 panzer divisions with over 1,800 tanks, moved swiftly through the forest in a continuous column stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The German advance utilized every available road and path, maintaining a strict timetable that allowed for the smooth flow of men and machines. The column never stopped. When a vehicle broke down, it was immediately pushed off the road to maintain the advance. On May 12th, French aerial reconnaissance finally confirmed the massive German armored concentration approaching the Meuse River. Yet the French Air Force, the Armée de l'Air, was unable to mount effective bombing raids against the vulnerable German columns. Years of budget cuts had left the French air fleet outdated and numerically inferior. When bombing runs were attempted, they were uncoordinated and ineffective. The opportunity to strike the Germans at their most vulnerable moment was lost. By the evening of May 12th, German armored spearheads had reached the Meuse River near Sedan, an achievement the French High Command had believed would take at least 9 days, not 3. Lieutenant Moreau and his men watched in disbelief as German reconnaissance units appeared on the opposite bank of the river. The quiet sector was about to become the focal point of the entire campaign. The morning of May 13th brought the full fury of the German Blitzkrieg. At Oitki, hundreds of Luftwaffe dive bombers descended on French positions along the Meuse. Wave after wave of Stuka aircraft screamed down, their distinctive sirens creating a psychological terror weapon as effective as the bombs themselves. The bombardment continued for hours, targeting French artillery positions and bunkers with devastating precision. Private François Maillard, a 30-year-old reservist from Marseille, described the experience in a diary later recovered from his effects. The noise is unbearable. The earth shakes continuously. Men around me are losing their minds. Some pray, others weep openly. Our officers seem as terrified as we are. We have never trained for anything like this. We cannot even return fire effectively, for the enemy is above us, and our anti-aircraft guns are few and outdated. The psychological impact of the bombardment was devastating. Many French units, composed largely of older reservists with minimal training, began to disintegrate even before German ground forces attacked. Some abandoned their positions without orders, others simply froze in terror. The intense bombing created a phenomenon that French military psychiatrists would later term stuka-schrecken, stuka terror, a collective shock that paralyzed the defenders' will to fight. At 16:00, German infantry began crossing the Meuse in rubber boats under the cover of artillery and machine gun fire. The crossing points had been carefully selected based on meticulous intelligence gathering. By evening, German engineers had established pontoon bridges, allowing the first tanks to begin crossing. The French defensive line, anchored on the natural barrier of the river, was breached in multiple locations. The German breakthrough at Sedan created a 50-mile-wide gap in the French lines. Through this gap poured the panzer divisions of Generals Guderian and Reinhardt. Unlike the methodical infantry-based warfare of the previous conflict, the German advance was characterized by speed and deep penetration. The objective was not to hold territory, but to paralyze the enemy's ability to coordinate a response by attacking command centers, communication nodes, and logistics. French attempts to seal the breach proved ineffective. Counterattacks were piecemeal, uncoordinated, and quickly repulsed. The French command structure, designed for the deliberate pace of World War I battles, was overwhelmed by the tempo of Blitzkrieg. Orders took hours to reach frontline units, by which time the situation had already changed dramatically. The Germans, by contrast, used radio communications to coordinate their forces in real time, allowing for rapid adaptation to evolving conditions. Captain André Beaufort, a staff officer at French General Headquarters, later wrote, "Our entire military system was designed to fight a methodical battle, proceeding by successive, carefully planned phases. The Germans were fighting a war of movement, where speed, initiative, and flexibility were paramount. It was as if we had prepared meticulously for a fencing match, only to find ourselves in a boxing ring." The French army possessed tanks equal or superior to their German counterparts in terms of armor and firepower. The Sommua S-35 and the heavy Char B-1BS were formidable machines that outclassed the German Panzer III and I-4 in direct combat. What the French lacked was not quality, but doctrine. French tanks were dispersed among infantry units for support rather than concentrated for decisive action. They lacked radio equipment, forcing commanders to communicate by flag signals or by physically moving between vehicles. Most critically, they were employed according to a methodical doctrine that emphasized deliberate advance rather than exploiting breakthroughs. By May 15th, just 5 days after the initial attack, German armored spearheads had broken through the French defenses and were advancing rapidly westward, bypassing pockets of resistance. The speed of the advance stunned the French High Command. General Gamelin, unable to comprehend the situation, issued contradictory orders that further confused subordinate commanders. On the ground, the experience for French soldiers was one of growing confusion and isolation. Lieutenant Jean-Louis Crémieux-Brillac, who would later become a prominent historian of the campaign, described the atmosphere. Communications were breaking down everywhere. Units would receive orders to advance to positions already occupied by the enemy or to hold ground that had been abandoned days earlier. There was no coherent picture of the front. Indeed, there was no longer a continuous front at all, merely islands of resistance in a sea of German advance. The chaos extended to the civilian population. As German forces pushed westward, millions of French civilians joined the exodus toward the south. Roads became clogged with refugees, hampering military movements and creating scenes of desperation. Military units trying to redeploy found themselves immobilized in the human tide. German aircraft strafed the congested roads, adding to the panic and confusion. This mass exodus, unprecedented in European history, was both a symptom and an accelerant of France's collapse. The sight of civilians fleeing in terror undermined the morale of soldiers, many of whom worried about the fate of their own families. The refugee crisis overwhelmed civil authorities and created a pervasive sense that the social order itself was disintegrating. By May 20th, German armored columns had reached Abbeville on the English Channel, effectively cutting off the Allied forces in Belgium from the rest of France. The most powerful elements of the French army, along with the entire British expeditionary force, were now trapped in a pocket with their backs to the sea. What military planners had believed impossible just weeks earlier had come to pass with shocking speed. The human cost of these developments was enormous. Thousands of French soldiers were killed or wounded in the initial breakthrough and subsequent pursuit. Many more, over 1.8 million by the campaign's end, would be captured and sent to POW camps in Germany. For these men, the war would continue in captivity for the next 5 years, a forgotten army whose absence would create lasting social wounds in French society. Among those taken prisoner was Corporal Marcel Duchamp, the schoolteacher who had been writing to his wife when the attack began. Separated from his unit during the chaotic retreat, he was captured near Saint-Quentin on May 19th. His last letter home, never mailed but later discovered among military records, captures the disillusionment that had overtaken many French soldiers. We have been betrayed not by any single person, but by our complacency, by our failure to understand the nature of modern war. We prepared to fight the last war while our enemy invented a new one. God help France now. The French leadership, meanwhile, was paralyzed by the speed and scale of the disaster. On May 19th, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud dismissed General Gamelin, replacing him with the 73-year-old General Maxime Weygand. It was a desperate move that changed little. Weygand, like Gamelin, was a product of the First World War, ill-equipped to comprehend or counter Blitzkrieg warfare. On May 18th, as the gravity of the situation became apparent, Prime Minister Reynaud telephoned his British counterpart, Winston Churchill, with a shocking admission. "We are defeated. We have lost the battle." Churchill, who had only become Prime Minister on May 10th, the day the German offensive began, flew to Paris to assess the situation firsthand. What he found was a French government teetering on the edge of collapse, with some ministers already advocating surrender. The French army, once considered the most powerful land force in Europe, was disintegrating. Entire divisions ceased to exist as coherent fighting units. Communication between different echelons of command broke down completely. The speed of events overwhelmed the capacity of headquarters to process information and issue relevant orders. It was, in the words of one French general, a rout transformed into a catastrophe by the paralysis of command. The human dimension of this collapse was captured by Captain Charles de Gaulle, commanding a tank unit in the 4th Armored Division. In a letter to his wife on May 27th, he wrote, "The army is breaking up like a rotten piece of cloth. The men are not cowards. They are simply overwhelmed by a form of warfare for which they were never prepared." This is not merely a military defeat. It is the failure of an entire system of thought. De Gaulle's observation was profoundly accurate. The French disaster of 1940 was not simply a failure of tactics or technology, but a failure of intellectual and institutional adaptation. While German military thinkers had spent the interwar years developing new doctrines suited to the age of mechanization, the French military establishment had largely calcified around the lessons of 1918, lessons that were no longer applicable to the reality of 1940. This intellectual failure extended beyond the military sphere. The Third Republic itself was suffering from political paralysis, with 33 different governments between 1919 and 1940. French society was deeply divided along ideological lines, with many, on both the far left and far right, harboring ambivalent or even hostile attitudes toward the Republic. When crisis came, these divisions undermined the national cohesion needed for effective resistance. By late May, as German armored columns raced toward Paris, the strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. In the north, the trapped Allied forces initiated a desperate evacuation from the port of Dunkirk. Between May 26 and June 4th, over 338,000 Allied troops, including 140,000 French soldiers, were evacuated across the English Channel in an operation that Churchill would call a miracle of deliverance. But for France, the miracle at Dunkirk was merely a temporary reprieve. The bulk of the evacuation was concentrated on saving the British Expeditionary Force, with French troops given lower priority. For many French soldiers and citizens, this created a lasting sense of abandonment that would color Franco-British relations for years to come. As one French officer bitterly remarked, the British fought to the last Frenchman. The reality was more complex. The British themselves had narrowly avoided a catastrophic military defeat, and their capacity to continue evacuations was limited. Nevertheless, the perception of betrayal became part of the emerging narrative that sought to explain the inexplicable, how the mighty French army had collapsed so quickly. By early June, as German forces prepared for the final push toward Paris, the French government was fracturing along the question of whether to continue resistance or seek terms. Prime Minister Reynaud favored continuing the fight, even if it meant retreating to French North Africa. Others, led by the aged Marshal Pétain, argued that France must seek an armistice to spare the population further suffering. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris, which had been declared an open city to spare it from destruction. The symbolic impact was devastating. Paris, the city of light, the heart of French culture and identity, was now under German occupation. For the first time since 1814, enemy soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. As news of Paris's fall spread throughout what remained of Free France, the psychological impact was profound. Lieutenant Marcel Hauet, commanding a unit near Orléans, wrote in his diary, "The men received the news in silence. There were no speeches, no cries of defiance or despair, merely a collective recognition that something fundamental had changed. France, the France we had known and believed eternal, had ceased to exist." The shock of Paris' fall reverberated through the remaining French forces. Years later, survivors would speak of this moment as when hope finally died. The impossible had happened. France, a great power with the largest army in Europe, had been defeated in just 6 weeks. For the soldiers still fighting, the question was no longer whether France could win, but what honor demanded of them in the face of inevitable defeat. The collapse of organized resistance accelerated after Paris fell. French units, already disorganized and low on supplies, disintegrated further. Command structures that had functioned, however imperfectly, for decades, simply ceased to operate. Junior officers found themselves making decisions that would normally require general staff approval, often with incomplete information and contradictory orders. The human dimension of this collapse was captured in the memoir of Sergeant Michel Lambert of the 7th North African Infantry Division. By mid-June, we no longer received any coherent orders. Our battalion commander had been killed during an air attack, and no replacement had arrived. We had not been resupplied in 5 days. Men were deserting in groups, simply walking away in broad daylight. No one tried to stop them. What was the point? France was finished. On June 16th, Prime Minister Reynaud resigned after failing to convince his cabinet to continue resistance from North Africa. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun, formed a new government with the explicit purpose of seeking an armistice with Germany. In a radio address on June 17th, Pétain told the French people, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that the fighting must cease." His words, delivered in the measured tones of a patriarch addressing his children, marked the official end of French resistance. For many French soldiers still in the field, the armistice announcement came as a relief. The pointlessness of further sacrifice had become evident as the strategic situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Private Robert Doisneau, who would later become a famous photographer, wrote, "When we heard Pétain's voice on the radio, there was no protest, no cry of betrayal. We had already accepted the reality of defeat. The Marshal was merely confirming what we already knew in our hearts." Others reacted with disbelief and anger. Captain Philippe de Hautecloque, later known as General Leclerc, refused to accept the armistice and made his way to England to continue the fight. A young lieutenant named Charles Couderc tore off his insignia and threw them into the fire upon hearing the news. "This is not France speaking," he told his men. "France does not surrender. Men surrender." On June 18th, the day after Pétain's speech, an obscure brigadier general named Charles de Gaulle delivered a very different message from London via BBC radio. "Has the last word been said?" he asked. "Must hope disappear? Is defeat final?" No. Few in France heard this first appeal of June 18th, but it marked the beginning of what would eventually become the Free French movement. The armistice between France and Germany was signed on June 22nd in the same railway carriage in Compiègne, where Germany had signed the 1918 armistice, a deliberate humiliation orchestrated by Hitler. The terms were harsh. Northern and Western France would be under direct German occupation. The French military would be largely disbanded. The French government would pay enormous occupation costs, and hundreds of thousands of French prisoners of war would remain in captivity. The human cost of the 6-week campaign was staggering. France suffered approximately 90,000 military deaths, with another 200,000 wounded. But perhaps the most lasting wound was the 1.8 million French soldiers taken prisoner, nearly half the mobilized force. These men would spend the next 5 years in German captivity, creating a void in French society that would have profound economic and psychological consequences. For the individual French soldier, the experience of capture and imprisonment represented the final humiliation of the campaign. Men who had been raised on stories of French military glory and the heroic sacrifices of the previous war now faced the shame of surrender and captivity. The mental adjustment was often as difficult as the physical hardships they would endure. Private Jean-Paul Sartre, who would later become one of France's leading philosophers, described the moment of his capture near Padoue. "We were ordered to lay down our weapons and form lines. As I placed my rifle on the growing pile, I experienced a sensation I had never felt before, a kind of vertigo, as if I were stepping out of my own life into an indefinite suspension of being. I was no longer a soldier, or even fully a citizen. I had become a prisoner, a status defined entirely by negation, by what I could no longer do, by the freedom that had been taken from me." The German victory was complete and overwhelming. In just 6 weeks, they had accomplished what they had failed to achieve in 4 years of brutal combat during the First World War. The cost to Germany was remarkably small, approximately 27,000 killed, 18,000 missing, and 111,000 wounded. German losses in the conquest of France were less than what they had suffered in single battles during the previous conflict. This disparity in casualties reflected the fundamental asymmetry of the campaign. The French had been defeated not primarily through attrition or superior firepower, but through operational paralysis induced by the speed and unpredictability of the German advance. It was, in many ways, the first truly modern campaign, a victory of tempo and psychological dislocation over raw military power. The immediate aftermath of defeat saw France divided not just territorially but spiritually. Marshal Pétain established a new authoritarian regime based in the spa town of Vichy, governing the unoccupied southern zone of France. Under the slogan "Work, Family, Fatherland," replacing the revolutionary liberty, equality, fraternity, the Vichy regime sought to create a national revolution that would regenerate France through traditional values and collaboration with Nazi Germany. Many French citizens, particularly those of conservative or traditionalist inclinations, rallied to Pétain's call. The Marshal, in their eyes, had saved France from total destruction by negotiating the Armistice. His program of moral regeneration resonated with those who had long seen the Third Republic as decadent and corrupt. As one Vichy supporter wrote, "Our defeat was not merely military, but moral. The Marshal offers us not just a government, but a redemption." Others, however, saw Vichy as the final betrayal. A small but growing resistance movement began to form, both within France and among French exiles abroad. The earliest resistors were motivated less by ideology than by a visceral rejection of defeat and occupation. Lieutenant Georges Lustonau-Lacau expressed this sentiment in a clandestine pamphlet distributed in late 1940. To accept the armistice is to accept that France has ceased to exist as an independent nation. This is not peace, but a slow death. Better to fight and risk everything than to submit and lose everything certainly. For the average French citizen, The immediate concern was survival in a radically altered landscape. The German occupation brought severe economic disruption, food shortages, and the constant fear of arrest. Rationing was introduced, and the black market soon became an essential part of everyday life. The social contract that had bound citizens to the state had been broken, replaced by an improvisational ethic of survival that would characterize life in occupied France. The fate of the 1.8 million French prisoners of war became a central preoccupation of the Vichy regime, which presented itself as the protector of these men. Propaganda posters depicted Pétain as a father figure watching over the prisoners, promising their eventual return. In reality, the vast majority would remain in captivity until 1945, their release contingent on French economic and political collaboration with the Third Reich. In the POW camps, French soldiers experienced a profound identity crisis. Captain Olivier Todd described the psychological impact. We had been raised to believe in France as an eternal entity, a beacon of civilization. Now we found ourselves in captivity, our country divided and occupied, our leaders collaborating with the enemy. What did it mean to be French in such circumstances? What values remained when the institutions embodying those values had collapsed? This existential questioning was not limited to the prisoners. Throughout France, citizens grappled with the meaning of the defeat and its implications for French identity. The speed and completeness of the collapse had shattered fundamental assumptions about France's place in the world and the strength of its institutions. As the philosopher Raymond Aron observed, for the first time in centuries, the French have been forced to consider the possibility that France might not be necessary to the world. The military lessons of the campaign were studied intensively by observers around the world, particularly in the United States and Soviet Union. The effectiveness of Blitzkrieg tactics made a profound impression on military planners who recognized that a new era in warfare had dawned. The U.S. Army, then in the early stages of mobilization, reorganized its armored formations based on German models rather than French ones, a telling commentary on which approach had proven superior. For the French military establishment, the process of understanding the defeat was complicated by the political divisions of the Vichy era. Official Vichy narratives emphasized moral failing and political betrayal rather than operational or doctrinal shortcomings. A 1941 report commissioned by the Vichy government blamed the defeat on the spiritual and moral disarmament of the nation, brought about by the left-wing Popular Front government of 1936-1938. This interpretation, while politically convenient for the Vichy regime, obscured the real military lessons of the campaign. The deeper issues of doctrinal rigidity, command paralysis, and failure to adapt to the tempo of modern warfare were left largely unexamined. It would take the post-war era and a new generation of military thinkers for France to fully confront the operational causes of its defeat. The long-term consequences of the 1940 defeat would shape French society and politics for decades to come. The Vichy period created wounds in the national psyche that would be slow to heal. Collaborators and resistors, Vichy supporters and Free French partisans, the divisions of the occupation years would continue to manifest in post-war politics and culture. Perhaps the most profound impact was on France's perception of itself. The myth of French invincibility, already damaged in the First World War, was shattered completely. The rapid collapse called into question not just military preparedness, but the vitality of French civilization itself. As one diarist wrote in July 1940, "It is as if we have awakened to find ourselves not merely defeated, but obsolete, belonging to a world that no longer exists." This crisis of confidence led to a profound reevaluation of French institutions after the war. The Fourth Republic, established in 1946, attempted to address the perceived weaknesses of its predecessor, though it would ultimately suffer from many of the same instabilities. Only with the establishment of the Fifth Republic under Charles de Gaulle in 1958 would France find a governmental system robust enough to overcome the legacy of 1940. The military lessons of the defeat, while initially obscured by political considerations, eventually led to a complete restructuring of French military doctrine. The experience of 1940 demonstrated that the defensive mindset that had dominated French strategic thinking since 1918 was no longer viable in the era of mechanized warfare. Post-war French military planners embraced mobility, integrated air-land operations, and tactical flexibility, precisely the elements that had been lacking in 1940. For the individual veterans of the campaign, the process of coming to terms with the defeat was deeply personal. Many struggled with feelings of shame and disillusionment that would last a lifetime. Jean-Louis Crémieux-Brillac, who escaped from a German POW camp and joined the Free French, later reflected, "We had been raised to believe that being French meant being part of something exceptional, something that transcended ordinary national identity. The collapse of 1940 forced us to question everything we had been taught about ourselves." Others found different lessons in the experience. Marcel Bijard, a young sergeant captured during the campaign who would later become one of France's most decorated officers, wrote in his memoirs, "In the prison camp, I made a promise to myself, if I survived and if France survived, I would dedicate myself to ensuring that such a defeat could never happen again." The lesson I took from 1940 was not that France was inherently weak, but that we had forgotten how to adapt, how to think creatively in the face of new challenges. The division of the French army after the Armistice reflected the broader divisions in French society. Most officers and men followed Marshal Pétain into what they saw as honorable captivity, accepting the Armistice as a necessary evil. A small minority, approximately 7,000 in total, managed to escape to Britain to join de Gaulle's Free French forces. Others remained in the truncated Armistice army, permitted by the Germans, while some joined the resistance within France. This fragmentation created complex loyalties and bitter recriminations that would outlast the war itself. Officers who had fought honorably in 1940 but then served the Vichy regime found themselves regarded as collaborators after liberation. Conversely, some who had been mediocre or even cowardly in the campaign later joined the resistance and emerged as heroes. As the historian Robert Paxton has observed, for many, the choices made after the defeat proved more definitive for their historical reputation than their actions during the campaign itself. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the French defeat was the gap between expectation and reality. France had entered the war confident in its military power and the strength of its alliances. The Maginot Line, far from being a symbol of defeatism as later caricatures would suggest, had been seen as a technological marvel, a testament to French engineering prowess and strategic foresight. The army, though hampered by budget constraints and doctrinal rigidity, was still regarded as a formidable fighting force. The psychological impact of having these certainties shattered in the space of 6 weeks cannot be overstated. Lieutenant Paul Carré, writing from a POW camp in July 1940, captured this sense of disorientation. We had prepared for a repeat of 1914-1918, a long, grueling war of attrition that would test national endurance. Instead, we experienced something entirely different, a war of movement and rapid decision for which we had no conceptual framework. It was as if we had carefully studied the rules of chess only to find ourselves playing a game whose rules we did not understand. The experience of French colonial troops during the campaign adds another dimension to the story. Approximately 120,000 soldiers from North and West Africa fought in the French army in 1940. Many performed with distinction. The Moroccan divisions in particular were regarded as elite units. Yet after the defeat, these soldiers often faced particularly harsh treatment in German captivity, and their contributions were frequently overlooked in official histories. Corporal Mohammed Ben Abdallah of the 7th Algerian Riflemen described his experience. "We fought for France because we believed in what France represented: civilization, justice, equality. When I was captured, the German officers separated us from the white French soldiers. 'You are not real Frenchmen,' he told us. 'Why did you fight for them? I had no answer that he would understand. The Blitzkrieg of 1940 represented more than just a military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire conception of warfare. The French army had prepared to refight the First World War with modest technological improvements. What they encountered instead was an entirely new operational paradigm that rendered their preparations largely irrelevant. General Alphonse Juin, one of the few senior officers to emerge from the campaign with his reputation intact, later wrote, "We were not defeated because our soldiers lacked courage or our equipment was inferior. We were defeated because we failed to understand the nature of modern war. We remained faithful to principles that had been overtaken by technological and doctrinal evolution. Our tragedy was not weakness, but anachronism." This assessment captures a fundamental truth about the campaign. The French defeat was not primarily material, but intellectual. France had the resources, the manpower, and in many cases the equipment to resist effectively. What it lacked was the doctrinal framework and institutional flexibility to employ these assets in a manner suited to the realities of mechanized warfare. The speed of the German advance created a situation for which French command structures were completely unprepared. Decisions that would normally be made after careful staff work and deliberation had to be made in hours or even minutes as the situation evolved rapidly. The German bombing campaign targeted command centers and communications nodes, creating an information vacuum that further paralyzed French responses. Colonel Charles Lohr of the French General Staff described the atmosphere at headquarters during the critical days of mid-May. Information arrived in fragments, often contradictory and always insufficient. Maps showed positions that had been abandoned hours earlier. Orders were drafted based on situations that no longer existed. The entire system was designed for a methodical tempo of operations, days to plan, hours to execute. The Germans were operating on a cycle of minutes to plan, seconds to execute. We were simply overwhelmed by the velocity of events. This failure of command was not merely technical, but conceptual. The French army, like most military organizations, had prepared primarily to refight its last war. The trauma of the First World War had created a defensive mindset that permeated military doctrine and national strategy. Static defense, methodical operations, and the primacy of firepower over maneuver, these principles, derived from the experience of 1914 to 1918, proved catastrophically ill-suited to the warfare of 1940. The contrast with German adaptation could not have been starker. Defeated in 1918 and severely constrained by the Versailles Treaty, the German military had been forced to innovate. Without the resources to match their potential enemies in quantitative terms, they had focused on qualitative advantages, better training, more flexible doctrine, and the integration of new technologies into a coherent operational concept. Heinz Guderian, the principal architect of German armored doctrine, had studied the same military theorists as his French counterparts. But where French officers had seen in the tank a mobile fortress to support infantry advances, Guderian had envisioned a completely new form of warfare based on deep penetration, exploitation of breakthroughs, and the psychological dislocation of the enemy command system. The result was a campaign that unfolded with a dreamlike inevitability. Each French counteraction seemed to come too late, addressing a situation that had already evolved beyond the response. By the time French reserves were mobilized to address the breakthrough at Sedan, the German armored spearheads were already driving for the Channel coast. By the time the gravity of the situation was fully grasped at French headquarters, the strategic catastrophe was already irreversible. For the French soldiers who experienced this collapse firsthand, the psychological impact was profound. Many had entered the war with a quiet confidence based on assumptions about French military power that had gone unchallenged for generations. The discovery that these assumptions were fundamentally flawed created a crisis of faith that transcended military dimensions. Sergeant Paul Ricoeur, who would later become one of France's most influential philosophers, described this crisis in terms that went beyond military defeat. What collapsed in those 6 weeks was not merely an army, but a worldview. We had believed ourselves heirs to a military tradition that guaranteed our security. We discovered instead that tradition, without adaptation, leads not to security, but to catastrophe. The legacy of the 1940 campaign would shape the post-war world in ways that extended far beyond France. The demonstration of Blitzkrieg's effectiveness influenced military doctrine in all major powers. The United States, in particular, absorbed the lessons of mechanized warfare and applied them with devastating effect against Germany and Japan in the later years of the war. The Soviet Union, after suffering its own catastrophic defeats in 1941, eventually mastered the principles of mechanized warfare and turned them against their German originators. For the French nation, the road to recovery would be long and difficult. The immediate consequence was 4 years of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and civil conflict that left deep scars on the national psyche. The post-war period brought a painful reckoning with the failures of 1940 and the compromises of the Vichy years. Only with the advent of the Fifth Republic under Charles de Gaulle did France begin to achieve a measure of reconciliation with its recent past. The military institution that emerged from this crucible was profoundly different from the one that had collapsed in 1940. The new French army emphasized mobility, flexibility, and independence of command. The defensive mindset gave way to a doctrine of forward engagement and preemptive action. Most significantly, France developed an independent nuclear deterrent, the ultimate guarantee against the kind of invasion that had proved so catastrophic in 1940. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the campaign was in the realm of national memory. The speed and completeness of the defeat created a trauma that could not be easily integrated into traditional narratives of French military glory. Unlike the First World War, which despite its horrors had ended in victory, the campaign of 1940 offered few compensating achievements to offset the humiliation of defeat. This difficulty in assimilating the experience led to what the historian Henry Rousseau has called the Vichy syndrome, a complex of repression, myth-making, and selective memory that characterized French engagement with the period for decades after the war. Official histories emphasized resistance over collaboration, individual heroism over institutional failure, and eventual liberation over initial defeat. Only in the 1970s and 1980s did a more nuanced historical accounting begin to emerge, acknowledging both the military failures that led to defeat and the complex reality of the occupation years. This historical reckoning paralleled a broader maturation in France's relationship with its past, a willingness to confront difficult truths that had previously been obscured by myth and selective memory. For the veterans of 1940, this reassessment often came too late. Many went to their graves bearing the undeserved stigma of a defeat that had been determined by factors largely beyond their control. The individual French soldier had fought with courage when effectively led and given the opportunity to engage the enemy. The failure was not one of personal valor but of institutional adaptation. Corporal René Lacoste, who survived both the campaign and 5 years as a POW, expressed this sentiment in a 1985 interview. "For decades, we were the forgotten ones. Neither heroes of resistance nor victims of the camps, just the defeated soldiers of a forgotten campaign. We carried the shame of a defeat that was not of our making. Only now as old men do we hear that perhaps it was not our fault after all." The shock of defeat in 1940 fundamentally altered France's conception of its place in the world. Never again would France attempt to maintain the status of a global power through conventional military strength alone. The post-war decades saw a strategic reorientation toward European integration, nuclear deterrence, and selective global engagement, a more realistic alignment of capabilities and commitments. This strategic adjustment was perhaps the most constructive response to the lesson of 1940. The campaign had demonstrated with brutal clarity the limitations of national power in the modern age. No single European nation, however prestigious its military traditions, could independently maintain security against a determined peer competitor. The path forward lay in alliance, integration, and the development of niche capabilities rather than comprehensive military power. The French army that participated in the liberation of 1944 and 1945 was very different from the one that had collapsed in 1940. Reborn from the remnants of the Armistice Army, the colonial forces, and the Free French, it had absorbed many of the tactical and operational innovations that had proven so effective against France 4 years earlier. Under leaders like General Philippe Leclerc, the former Captain Philippe de Hautecloque, who had rejected the armistice, French armored divisions practiced a form of mobile warfare that would have been unrecognizable to the commanders of 1940. This transformation demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of military institutions when confronted with the stark reality of failure. The same organization that had been paralyzed by the pace of operations in 1940 had, within the span of 4 years, reinvented itself to operate effectively in a radically different doctrinal environment. It was a testament to institutional learning, albeit at enormous cost. For the individual soldiers who had experienced the campaign firsthand, the memory never faded. Decades after the war, survivors could recall with perfect clarity the moment when they realized that something unprecedented was occurring, that the war they were fighting was fundamentally different from the one they had prepared for. Lieutenant Marcel Bijard, captured during the campaign, and later one of France's most decorated officers, described that moment. It was near Sedan, on the afternoon of May 14th. I saw our lines breaking, men running in panic, officers unable to restore order, and overhead the constant presence of German aircraft, striking wherever they wished. In that moment, I knew that everything we had been taught about modern war was wrong. It was a revelation that came too late to save us, but would shape my entire military career thereafter. This recognition that warfare had fundamentally changed was the essential insight that had escaped the French military establishment before the campaign. The failure was not one of courage or commitment, but of imagination and adaptation. The French army of 1940 was prepared to fight effectively, according to the precepts of a type of warfare that no longer existed. Against an enemy that had moved beyond those precepts, it found itself conceptually disarmed. The lesson is one that retains its relevance in the modern era. Military organizations, by their nature, tend toward conservatism. They codify the lessons of past conflicts into doctrine and training, creating institutional momentum that can be difficult to redirect when circumstances change. The challenge is to maintain the core competencies and traditions that give a military institution its strength, while remaining adaptable enough to recognize and respond to emerging threats. The French experience of 1940 stands as a warning of what happens when this balance tilts too far toward tradition and away from adaptation. It reminds us that military effectiveness is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process, requiring constant reassessment and evolution. The price of failing to learn this lesson, as France discovered in those 6 catastrophic weeks, is measured not just in battlefield defeats, but in national trauma and transformation. The Blitzkrieg of 1940 represents more than just a military campaign. It marks a pivotal moment in the evolution of modern warfare. The operational concepts demonstrated by the German forces, the coordination of air and ground elements, the concentration of armor for breakthrough, the emphasis on disrupting enemy command and control, have become standard elements of contemporary military doctrine. What was revolutionary in 1940 has become conventional wisdom incorporated into the training and planning of armies worldwide. For France, the journey from the catastrophe of 1940 to the integrated European power of today has been long and often painful. The wounds of defeat and occupation required decades to heal fully. Yet in that process of healing and reconstruction, France found a new identity, less imperial but more sustainable, less militaristic but ultimately more secure. The soldiers who experienced the shock of Blitzkrieg firsthand could not have foreseen this evolution. For them, the collapse of France represented an unmitigated catastrophe, the failure of institutions and traditions they had been raised to revere. Yet in that very failure lay the seeds of renewal, a recognition that adaptation is not betrayal but necessity, that change is not weakness but strength. In the final analysis, the story of French soldiers facing the German Blitzkrieg in 1940 is not merely a tale of defeat, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of catastrophic change. The men who experienced the collapse firsthand, the confusion, the fear, the sense of abandoned duty, carried those memories through the occupation years and into the post-war era. Many use that experience as motivation to rebuild, to reform, to ensure that such a collapse could never happen again. Their legacy lives on in a France and a Europe transformed by the lessons of that fateful campaign, a continent that has learned, at terrible cost, that security lies not in static defenses or military traditions, but in cooperation, adaptation, and the courage to envision and prepare for a future that may bear little resemblance to the past.